other speakers introduce themselves, and then we'll get right to it. So I'm Sahil Cheney. I lead our customer marketing here at Transcend. I've been here about 2.5 years, working with customers, utilities, engineering firms, equipment suppliers all across the world on adopting Transcend, which is a generative design tool. Today, we're going to take a little bit of a step higher up here to talk about software strategy, and we're going to focus on the power industry. It's a vertical that we've been entering over the last year, and we wanted to help you all understand how you can approach software and make sure you get the most out of your investment. I will introduce Zach, and then Lorenzo, you can introduce yourself. Go ahead, Zach.
Yeah, thanks, and welcome everyone. I'm Zachary Wassenberg. I recently joined Transcend about 2.5 months ago, prior to my time at Transcend, where I currently lead our power product vertical as the senior product manager. I was with a major architectural engineering construction firm, where I spent almost a decade designing, constructing substations for the electric utility market, and I did projects across almost all of North America. I also did a lot of innovation project management and developed a lot of new engineering tools and workflows for our customers and for our internal engineers as well.
Awesome. My name is Lorenzo Slay. I'm the Director of Energy at Transcend. I've been at Transcend a little over 1.5 years. Got my start in the utility industry, spent a decade working with utilities, specifically doing design work, kind of got started doing design engineering, worked my way up through management. Ultimately, the focus of my time in that space with the utilities was helping utilities adopt new digital technologies, whether they're for control systems or new software systems for design work. So joined Transcend after doing that for a good little while. And Transcend, as a company, we're a climate tech company that's focused on bringing critical infrastructure technologies to utilities, engineering firms, and equipment vendors. And as a part of that, we do a lot of obviously consultations about software, how to deploy usually our software. But in this conversation, we'll be talking about software very broadly. There's a lot going on in the power and energy industry right now, and a lot of excitement around new technologies. So we'd like to just kind of share some of the lessons that we've learned over the years when trying to deploy new technologies, as a lot of you are looking towards 2024 and some goals and objectives you might have for next year. So that's a little bit what we'll be talking about.
Excellent. Thanks, Lorenzo. I'm going to set the stage a little bit of why we're talking about this and what does software mean in the power industry. So this is a small graphic here. You'll see there's going to be about a $5 billion spend in software in the power sector by 2025. I'm guessing it might actually exceed this, considering how fast adoption is happening in the industry. You can see on the left here in 2020, the breakdown between all the different types of power. On the right-hand side, you'll see that the renewable industry is really starting to take precedence here with a lot more investment in software. So with that, I wanted to ask Zach and Lorenzo, where have you seen from your experience in the power industry opportunities where software is most valuable?
Yeah, I can start us off here. So taking kind of a step back, there's really two mindsets here in terms of where software can add value. And the two mindsets are low-hanging fruit, which is those things that are immediate pain points and are going to be easily achievable in the short run. And then there's the other mindset of we have to tackle the big existential problems that are facing our industry and our organization right now. There's no time to wait on those. As we talk through this, you'll probably hear a couple of opinions on which side each one of us is on, and which side might be best for your organization. I err a little bit on the side of trying to start quickly, especially if you've never done a software strategy or software deployments within your organization. And the reason I tend to start small is because you can start to get your feet under you. You can start to understand what this takes from an organizational perspective to actually do this, be it build, buy, or a partner relationship. Each one of those is going to be different. But from an immediate standpoint, I always focus in on what are your people constantly complaining about? What are those things in their day to day that they say, wow, this is just absolutely terrible. It takes up 50% of my time and I should be focusing on other things. So those are the things I tend to listen to very closely. There are other pictures, latent needs or hidden needs that people don't always talk about. But as you start to scratch deeper than just the surface level, you start to identify and understand. But from a high level, that's what I'm thinking about. I'm interested what Lorenzo has to say on this topic.
Yeah, I think that's a really good perspective, Zach. You know, when I want to zoom in on one thing you kind of were nailing was the pain points. And I think there's a couple of major pain points in the industry right now, especially in the utility space, critical infrastructure very broadly. We're seeing, but it's definitely applicable to what we're seeing in the power industry. Um, uh, like people resources is a huge one. Um, there is a lot more work out there, a lot more going on in the power sector than has been in the past. It's certainly suddenly sexy to be a power engineer or doing power system design, which is really cool. And at the same time, there's a lot of really senior folks who are retiring and moving on to a different phase of their life. And so, right, like every organization, every design organization we talk to right now is having issues with like, how are we going to do the amount of work with the people that we have? And that's one pain point that software can definitely be useful for, is trying to be more effective with the resources that you have. The other pain point that I've seen be really successfully addressed with software is um, knowledge transfer and retention for organizations. So talking about people who are retiring and how are you going to capture and retain that knowledge in the organization, software can be a huge opportunity to do that for your organization, whether that's capturing their knowledge in a knowledge database like an internal wiki, or baking in some of that know-how, kind of aggregating spreadsheets of design automation that senior engineers have been putting together over the years, or best practices into a software platform that can kind of drive that consistency in the organization. Knowledge retention is a really big opportunity. So for both of those, what we're seeing a lot of is repetitive tasks, tasks that are rule-based, and that we have just a lot of volume on. Basically, if you're hitting those three things, if it's a repetitive task, you have a lot of it, and it's rule-based, and it matches up to a pain point that you're seeing in the organization, then having a software strategy for how to overcome that can be really, really effective.
Thanks, Lorenzo. I find oftentimes rolling out software can feel somewhat like this, where you've identified a problem, trying to implement it and drag the organization along with you. Usually a select few who are bought in, and they really have to get the rest of the organization on board. Even from my own experience, and I think we've all felt that, where our company will buy a software, they'll give it to us and say, hey, here's what we're using now, with very little enablement, and figure out where it fits in our workflow and why we're supposed to use it. And so before we get into the positives and getting into what people should do, maybe we can talk through, Zach and Lorenzo, from your experience, an example of where you were like, yeah, this software, maybe in specifically in the power industry, this rollout didn't go well, or things that you thought could have been done better in that process. Zach, I'm gonna start with you.
Yeah, all of them. No, joking aside, your first deployment will always be your most difficult, and it will never go as well as you had hoped it would have gone. That's why I mentioned try to start small, because if you know that you're going to struggle with your first step, at least it's a small one. The first step's always the most difficult. Really, what we'll talk about later in this presentation is why this strategy is so important. And a big part of it is the learning process and the direction of the organization. That said, you'll learn over time if you do that start small process, even if you're tackling those big existential problems that Lorenzo was mentioning, like there not being enough electrical engineers in the world to support the type of growth that the United States is going to see in the infrastructure that we're deploying. Even if you do those in parallel, learning slowly over time, you're going to find the right way to lead that horse to water without it constantly pulling back on you.
Yeah, without picking on any one specific organization or experience, what I have seen has been consistently a challenge with deploying software and seeing the return on investment, and, has been when organizations, especially design organizations, are introduced to software. So it's brought into the design organization because there was an initiative to do that, or because the industry is moving in that direction. And there's not a direct correlation between the needs of the end users and the software, either whether it's a platform or a service that that's being deployed. And so it can be really challenging, especially for design organizations, because oftentimes design organizations are an ancillary or support organization to an overall business objective, whether you're a utility or not as much on engineering firms, but certainly sometimes OEMs. It can be hard to align the business objectives with how it impacts design organizations and users. And what I would really encourage is to kind of prevent these types of things happening, doing the user requirements gathering and objectives early on can really help with that, to align the organization to what the value of the platform is.
Absolutely. And this is where, the crux of this presentation is going to be why you need a software strategy. I think we really highlighted the challenges that you can have if you don't, but also I think you leave a lot of value on the table when you're trying to implement a software and it doesn't meet the wider business objectives. And it also won't have the longevity that you want it to. You put all this effort to evaluate different software, you identify one, you want it to be successful, but it's really important to set it up for success at the very beginning and then continuously make sure you're measuring to make sure that it is successful for your organization. We've seen this done both ways, especially even at Transcend, but a lot of software is my fourth software company. And I think we've seen it done really well, where the people implementing the software are not siloed. They are talking to people across the organization and everyone understands what this is supposed to bring. And then we've all seen examples where it's a select few, sometimes in this innovation world or sometimes in the separate team, and the rest of the business has no idea what this is supposed to do. So we're going to talk through some really quick, we were hoping really actionable steps that you can take to avoid these pitfalls that we've just identified. So Zach, I'll start with you on what are some of the main components of a software strategy and how should folks begin this process?
Yeah, so the first step that I always talk about is making sure the appropriate people are in that room. For a lot of organizations, my recommendation would probably be to have the CEO, at least in the initial meeting. There may be responsibility and accountability that is assigned to another executive, but having the right people in the room, and the reason for that is, as Sahil talked about, you have to have this aligned with the business itself. It cannot be misaligned, it can't be islanded. So many times, as we talk through with organizations, there are things like the innovation team or things like the software team where they may have started with like a great vision, a great strategy, but they never had the right people in the room. And so they got kind of islanded, isolated, and then eventually they just kind of are insulated from the rest of the organization and never truly aligned with the business itself. And when you have those people in the room, you're just trying to ask some really big picture questions like, why are we here? What is the software strategy that we are trying to achieve? And why are we trying to achieve that? And then how are we going to do that? The how is pretty important for a variety of different organizations, from AEC firms to OEMs to the utilities themselves, of identifying a couple of big picture processes or just even frameworks that would then be developed further on. Things like, how are we going to fund this? If you're a utility, capitalization is very important to you. Can we capitalize this type of software that we're going after? What are the buckets that we know exist in terms of software? If it's associated with an asset, we can probably capitalize it. If that software is not associated with an asset, can we capitalize that? So those are some of the big picture items that you'll have to think about. And from a funding perspective, because money drives so many things, you need to identify where that money is coming from and how do you allow others within the organization to access it. So I always recommend early on to think about the money as one of the first steps as you're going forward, because it's going to clear a lot of the roadblocks that the teams and the people that are associated with these software projects going forward, it's going to clear those roadblocks for them so much better than trying to deal with that later on down the road. And then you talk a little bit about the process of, how are we going to do this? How are we going to identify the problems that we want to solve? You don't even need to know which problems you're going to solve at this step. It's just, how are we going to identify those? How are we going to build a team around understanding those problems, finding vendors, building it in-house, maybe developing career plans for those people? All of these are very high level things that you need to think about. And then I'll end on the note of, ultimately, who is going to own this thing, right? You identify this huge problem or small problem, you build something for it, or you purchase a software off the shelf. And now that you've done all of this and you've deployed it, maybe you were successful at deploying it with proper change management, who's going to own that platform? Who's going to own that tool? We see these types of things even on a small level. Maybe some of you have Excel files that have just slowly grown over time within the organization, and now there's 15 different versions of it. That same type of thing happens when ownership is not identified. So it kind of comes back to the career path aspect that I mentioned earlier of, who's going to own this and how is this going to impact their career? These are the types of questions that you want to talk about and try to answer in these discussions.
Anything to add, Lorenzo?
Yeah, I was gonna say, first of all, I love the fact that you talk about funding, and I'll talk a little bit about that on the next slide. But it is impossible to understate how important it is to investigate early and come up with a strategy very early for how you're going to fund any software strategy or development or deployment. Whether you're doing software development in-house, you're going to develop your own product and maintain it, or you're going to procure a piece of software, there has to be a discussion of funding. The only other thing I wanted to kind of touch on that maybe isn't on this sheet, but can be very actionable, is scope creep is very much a challenge with software and kind of attacking pain points. Just like with lots of different projects or objectives, it's very easy to, like, once you see the potential of where it can go, not to try to swallow the whole elephant at once. And so being very cognizant of what the original objective of the software is, and hitting and setting milestones that start, even if it's a very large objective, start with very actionable small first steps, and kind of adhering to an 80-20 principle of, you can get 80% of the bang for 20% of the buck, and not trying to solve every problem to the nth degree, but make progress over targeting perfection, can be hugely helpful in getting down the road in terms of any software deployment development, procurement. So that was the other thing I would suggest.
Thanks, Lorenzo. All right, so the next piece, I know we talked a little bit about the pitfalls, but I wanted to talk through, some of the challenges that we've all seen from our experience and a list of don'ts. Zach went through, here are the things you do need to do, and now we want to set it up a little bit with the things you don't want to be doing. Lorenzo, you want to take this?
Yeah, these are a couple of things that I'm really passionate about. I've seen some very challenging situations because of things like this. The biggest one for sure is do not treat software as a project. Software is never a project. Depending on how big or transformative the piece of software is, it's more analogous to hiring a team member. So when you think about hiring a new team member, you think about onboarding them, you think about who they need to interface with as a stakeholder, you think about how their role in the organization is going to evolve over time. You understand that this is a long-term commitment and relationship. You really do a lot of diligence up front to determine that you have the right candidate. This is the way to think about any software deployment. And the more transformative it is, the bigger the organizational analog. So if you're bringing on a new ERP piece of software, or CRM, or a platform like Transcend, you have to be thinking like, this is like hiring a whole new team and installing a whole new team in my organization. So now you're thinking about, how does it impact my workflows? What are the major KPIs for success for this team? What does that return on investment look like? And again, it's a very large ongoing commitment in terms of bringing it into your organization. So, I said one of the biggest differences, with a project, it's a very kind of fixed linear flow. If I have a start, I have some milestones, and I have an endpoint. I would say with software, the biggest difference is, while there's definitely a starting point, there really is no endpoint. The end of the journey for the software is when you decide that you're going to retire it and maybe adopt a new system, or when your organization outgrows that function altogether. So really looking at software more as a organizational change and bringing in a new resource that way than a project. The second thing I've seen is software is very exciting to younger folks in the industry. And it's because they're thought of as projects, it's often attractive to assign individuals to software deployments. And the overlap results in often newer team members, less experienced team members being the ones who are leading software development and/or deployment efforts in lots of design organizations. I would recommend, I think this is a huge pitfall, that more senior members of your organizations are the ones that should be leading the process of identifying software needs, leading the development and deployment rollout of those softwares for a couple of different reasons. But the biggest is knowledge of the organization. We talk about this all the time. Software is not about the code or the function, it's about the people. And your most senior people in your organization are going to have the relationships and knowledge within the organization to make sure that the software makes a difference. And that can be very challenging for junior team members. Not that they don't have a role to play, certainly they do. They can be a huge resource, but when you're talking about who's leading those efforts, definitely pays to have more experienced folks leading.
Yeah, I can add a few of my thoughts of things that I've seen in the past and what I try to avoid. Ultimately, it boils down to knowing yourself and knowing the organization that you're within, and being truthful to yourself about that, knowing where your flaws as an organization are and where your strengths are, and trying to play to those. I was at a conference once, and there was a retired executive from one of the very expensive consulting firms that you can hire for $1,200 an hour. And he made a joke, but he followed the joke up saying this is the actual honest truth of it, which is why it's so funny. He said his job as a $1,200 an hour consultant was to listen to the people in the organization and convey that summary back to the executive team. So you can go and hire those types of people, but ultimately you can just listen to them yourself. They will tell you and they will be honest with you what they're capable of. And they'll also tell you where you need to make changes. You'll never get this right the first time. Like I said at the start of this, you're probably not going to do as well as you want to do on your first attempt. But if you listen to your people and you make changes where appropriate, it will go well. But just make sure that you're constantly listening, constantly engaging in the people, because these strategies at a high level are trying to solve problems, but those problems affect the people at the end of the day. So from an adoption standpoint, from a deployment standpoint, from a success standpoint, it all revolves around those individuals within your organization. So just make sure you're listening to them.
I love that so much. I think we've all been in a situation where people are like, here, try out the software. And, I don't even know what problem it's supposed to solve for me. And I don't know the main strategy that I can then communicate back, Zach, to your point of, hey, this is working and these things need to be improved. So I think that's such a good point of that communication piece, which is the biggest challenge, I think, at every organization is information transfer and communication. And software is no different. People sometimes think software is a silver bullet. I'm just going to put it in the organization. It's going to solve all these problems. But it really comes down to the people and whether they know what to do to solve these problems. And the other thing we do is we set it and forget it. So kind of related to that, if you're always listening, you will automatically hear ways of improving either the strategy and or the actual software itself. And I think it'll also allow you to figure out what other software you need to complement the one you already have. One software is going to solve all your problems, but having an overall strategy that allows you to have how all of these different pieces of software work together for someone's workflow is so important. Otherwise, it becomes super disjointed. And as a user, you just become very frustrated with all of them because they don't talk to each other. So I think regardless of what it is you're trying to solve, whether it is in design organizations or other parts of your organization, it's so important to continuously evaluate what's working and what's not. And also people change, right? So to Zach's point, again, it's all about the people. If the people are changing, how they do work is changing, you also want to make sure the software and your organization keeps up. Awesome. So I have a question here before we go into the key takeaways and sort of the final section of this webinar. One of the things we touched on the previous slide, but we haven't, I know lots of people in the audience may want to know, how do you decide whether you're going to build or buy a software? From your experience, what are some of the things that you would want to evaluate and think about while making that decision? Lorenzo, I can go to you and then Zach.
Yeah, I'll jump in.
Yeah.
I think it very much depends on when I think about design organizations that I've led and whether or not it makes sense to build or buy. It comes down to what is our core business and what is our culture. Those are kind of the two things. Like, how do you make money? And then like philosophically, what are you good at and what do your people like to do? Like, what's your culture as an organization? So if the service of the software, so like the function that the software provides is potentially core to your business, like in some case it is for engineering firms, it may make more sense to build your own than to buy. But if you're really more interested in technical efficiencies that can be brought to your organization specifically through the application of technology, and you don't care as much about the underlying technology itself, then buying can often be a better choice. And then culturally, if your organization is like really innovative, like everyone's like one word describes this organization, innovative, then I think building software can be really beneficial and valuable exercise to the organization. If on the other hand, change management is not a strength of your organization, if you're like, man, like every single thing we change is really challenging and doesn't feel like a good experience, then software development is probably not the thing for you, because successful internal development is all about change management. And you own it soup to nuts. So you own the requirements gathering, you own the development, you own the rollout, you own the maintenance. And every single piece of that impacts the organization a different way. And you really have to be on top of change management for that to really work.
Yeah. So from my perspective, I came from an AEC firm, and there are a few AEC firms out there in the industry right now, slowly building software development execution teams. And I would kind of fall back to that, my original thoughts on if you have alignment with the CEO and you have career paths built out for this and you've actually put due diligence and thought into it, building it yourself is not off the table, but it should be something that you put a lot of thought into because it is very expensive. It is hugely less expensive to just go buy something off the shelf. But one of the things that I think a lot about isn't just build or buy. There's also the partnership model. When I was at an AEC firm, I always enjoyed that because every firm is going to have their strengths and you're going to know that. And you can also, if you're good at self-reflecting, understand your weaknesses. And if you have a partner come in, you can kind of fill those gaps with the weaknesses where just build or buying it maybe has something left to be seen. So I would encourage everyone to think about, have those self-reflection moments within your organization. And if you do find a good partner, someone that you trust, those relationships, as with many of the relationships in this industry, can grow over time and really make or break organizations.
Absolutely.
You
Yes,
know,
Lorenzo, go ahead.
Connecting back to this last point on this slide, don't set it and forget it. Like the days of delivering software as a product, just purely as a product, are just about over. And a huge part of that is because as we've kind of advanced and as software has advanced, the value in the software has become like how it connects to different parts of our organization and different parts of our business. And so when you're like everyone's really excited about generative AI and AI right now, like AI requires data, and data comes from a bunch of different disparate sources. Some of it's going to be in your sales sources, some of it's going to be in unstructured data, like it's from all over the place. And so for a lot of organizations to get the rich value that they're looking for, that they're conceptualizing out of software products, they're gonna have to interface with other software products. So if you're gonna build, you really should be in the business of like building software. Like the organization should come to the conclusion that we are gonna have a software development part of our business. We're gonna have a leadership team for that. We're gonna have a dedicated engineering team for that, and because ultimately it comes down to you can't set it and forget it. You're gonna have to maintain it to continue to see value. And as other parts of your organization mature, it's gonna drive new requirements for that initiative A that you went down the road on. So I think that's the other challenge for smaller scope software changes or opportunities. I think it can make sense to do in-house work. But when you start to think about transforming an organization or long-term maintenance, it becomes strategic, I think, to find partners, as Zach mentioned, that can really help.
Absolutely. The other piece I always say is there's oftentimes one or two people, it's their part-time job to maintain this legacy software that you've built. It's not even their full-time job. And I think that's where you really start to see the struggle. if they retire or leave, you lose all that knowledge, and it becomes a very difficult thing to maintain internally. So unless you have like Lorenzo said, a whole team dedicated to continuously improving the software companies that's literally all they're doing, right? So it's important to think about, as you're a utility or an AEC, this other organization, that is all they're doing, is building software, maintaining it, taking feedback from customers, and building on top of it continuously. And that's their business model. And so if you are going to do something like that, you really have to think about it as not just a part of the business, but literally like, how does it match what we really want to be doing it for in the future for our business? So I think it's important to remember all the different things that come along with it. We have a question in the chat. This is a little bit more about evaluation of software. So often, now we've talked a lot about the strategy. It can often be a challenging process to figure out, how do you evaluate technologies? So do you guys have general recommendations of things to keep in mind when evaluating different software technologies? And Zach, I'll start with you.
Yeah, absolutely. So my recommendation would be to take a step back and make sure that you fully understand the problem that you're trying to solve before you pick a technology. One of the things that I used to do, and I still do to this day, is interview as many people as you can. That can be in the form of in-person conversations, which you're going to get a lot more nuance out of people interactions. It can be in the form of surveys that are sent out to select groups within your own organization or others. There's a variety of ways to try to identify that feedback and that pain point. An example that I've had in my past was, we thought that we as an organization at one point in a past life wanted to have AI technology. And so we started to go down the route of purchasing AI technology. And then as I really started to dig deeply into the users that we were talking with, my colleagues, about, hey, we've got this software that we purchased. It can help you with all this stuff. It's an AI software. What we found was they just wanted a better data management platform than Microsoft Explorer. So we went and bought this AI software, and what we found was we should have went and found a better way to manage our data and had better data governance, and found a technology that supported that. So my recommendation is, make sure you understand the pain point. And when you do that, you'll be able to come up with a list of key criteria and then nice to haves that you can maybe compare different technology solutions against each other.
I'll be brief. I'm really curious your perspective, Sahil, because I think this is something that you kind of work through a lot. What I've seen work well is treating software evaluation like you would treat lots of other types of evaluation, actually having a rubric, writing down what success looks like. Is like the number one recommendation. If you cannot write down what success looks like, then you should not procure software for that thing. And this is kind of going back to Zach's example. It is not unusual for me to get inquiries from folks looking for software that does AI. And I'm like, well, tell me a little more about that. What are you trying to achieve specifically? And I have gotten responses that do not articulate what the organization is trying to achieve. There's an initiative to do something with AI, and so I'm looking for an AI thing. Like that's not a plan. So that's not particularly helpful for doing technology evaluation. So writing it down would be my recommendation.
Yeah, it should probably be on the pitfalls here, but don't let a vendor happy hour sway your decision on a multi-million-dollar investment.
Absolutely. I was going to say, in this process, there's often no two software that is exactly alike. And so that key criteria of must-haves is so important. And you'll start to figure out certain software do certain things better, but not others. And you really have to prioritize what you as an organization want to achieve with this. One of the best things that I've seen folks do is you have this team that, evaluating software, but they'll actually have users go in, and if there's a trial or some sort of view of these different pieces of software, I I've seen this so often. The leadership will buy the software and then communicate with the users. And I think it can be so difficult at that point if the user, like Zach's example, is like, that's not really what I needed or want. But I think if you bring them at least some key folks at the very beginning, the implementation and deployment will be just so much more successful. And I think you'll actually you'll choose a software that better matches the pain point that these people have. So I think kind of adding to Zach and Lorenzo, you have to have the criteria, but you have to understand the pros and cons for each of the different pieces of software. Literally, like I know in engineering, everyone's really used to these like rubric and weighting, and when you do RFPs, most utilities have a way that they evaluate it. So I would approach it very similarly, actually. Think of each of these as a request for proposals, that they tell you what they're good at and what are the things that will be included and not included, and compare that with different between the different ones. I find software, sometimes we don't go into that rigorous evaluation, and you kind of get swept away by these happy hours, or like, ooh, this is so cool, like I know for sure it's going to work, without asking the folks in your organization.
That's a really good point. Providing the rubric to the software company that you're evaluating is a
Never
good
happened
idea.
To me before. I wish.
Is a good idea, because I mean, anyone who's done engineering work, design engineering projects, like the number one thing you're worried about when you're doing an RFP is like, am I doing an apples to apples comparison between my vendors? And the industry is getting better at writing better specifications and scopes of work so that they can reduce risk when it comes to who they choose for a vendor. The same thing applies to software. Like you should give the software companies that you're evaluating a rubric and then see how they perform against that rubric, having given them the insight of like what's important to you. That way you can really increase your chance or decrease the risk of you not getting a apples to apples comparison.
All right, so if anybody in the audience has more questions, feel free to use the Q&A or the chat, please. We'll start to get into the wrapping it up, but this is fairly casual, so I can definitely stop and answer any questions if you guys have. All right, so as we kind of tie a bow onto this first of 3 webinars, the 3 things that we really wanted folks to take away, and I'll summarize these, and Zach and Lorenzo, I'll go to you for some last thoughts that you have. Strategic alignment across the business. You've heard us talk about in many different ways today. And the reason why we're really hammering this one home is that this is often a missed step, is you go into the project without talking to the stakeholders. Yes, it takes longer. We understand that, but that is well worth it in the end. If you really want to get the value that you're looking for, rushing through a process without talking to the right people is not going to help in the end anyway. Mindful decision making, really listening. I love that we highlighted that. Listening, really understanding where you're going to find money for the software. There's many times we've talked to people that they're like, yeah, we really want to evaluate software, but they don't know where in the budget it's going to come from. And so it shouldn't come the opposite way, where you evaluate software first and then figure out where to fund it. It's a lot easier if you know, hey, this is my budget, and that is going to be one of the things that you're going to evaluate different softwares, how much they cost and whether you can fund it. So doing it that way is going to be a lot smoother for all parties involved, and figuring out who's going to own it in terms of deployment as well as long-term, who in the organization, and really making that ownership clear to everybody. And of course, software is ever evolving faster than ever before. So this is such an important piece of continuously saying, is this working for us? As a software company, we always say every renewal term allows us to basically win back business over and over again. So this allows you to say, is this going the way I want it to? Am I getting the ROI and the value from the software? And really give feedback back to the companies. Every software company lives on customer feedback. So that's a big part of the process. Zach, I'll start with you for your last thoughts, and then Lorenzo.
Yeah. So my final thoughts, and we've touched on this quite a few times throughout, but just in summary, make sure that you are intentional with what you do. Um, and your strategy will help you with that. So when you put your strategy together, as you're putting your strategy together, and you're going through technology evaluations, picking vendors, there might be times in which you feel like you're chasing a shiny object. And when you are intentional with this and you have a strategy, you can go back to your strategy and go, is this potentially shiny object in alignment with my strategy? Or am I being misled and am I following a path that I shouldn't be going down? So with this strategy and with this strategic alignment, just be intentional with what you do, and you won't fall into the trap of chasing shiny objects.
What I would add is, first and foremost, this is hard. Like this whole software strategy thing is difficult. It's tough for software organizations to do. So it's even more difficult for non-software organizations to do. And each one of these things is difficult. So strategic alignment, one thing to keep in mind for sure is you have two different, often very different stakeholders when it comes to any piece of software. You have the business from a business perspective, what they want to achieve with a piece of software, and you have the end users. So a really good example is I would like a piece of design software. As a business leader, I'd like a piece of design software that helps my people design critical infrastructure more quickly to reduce cost. So you need software that's going to help like drive ROI and be fast. The end user may hear, I'm getting a piece of software that's going to help me design. That's very different than design quickly. And so aligning these two to, okay, which parts of the design process can we make more quick? Which parts of the design process do we just want to be better from a design perspective for the end user? Two different interests. How do we align these? And then making mindful decisions in terms of funding and strategy. It's oftentimes that the funding source will drive business requirements. And so what can happen is if you do, like Hill mentioned, you do the funding decision making after you've selected a piece of software, you'll find that that piece of software doesn't meet the funding business units requirements, and so now you're in a little bit of a do loop. And then the continuous improvement evaluation, I think also made another great point. Lean on your partners, whether they're internal or external, to continuously improve and evaluate. Software organizations, like Sahil said, they thrive. They live and die on customer feedback. And your feedback is certainly important. So certainly communicate.
For sure. And if they don't live or die on customer feedback, that's a very telling sign.
You can find one that does.
Yeah. All right. So as we said, is the first of 3 webinars we're doing. You've heard us talk a little bit about AI. We didn't want to go into that yet because we want to talk about why you need a strategy before you even touch AI, and what it can do for your business. But that's what we're unlocking in the next webinar. It'll be early next year. You'll get a follow-up for sure with more details. So as parting thoughts, Zach and Lorenzo, I want to see, what are you excited about when we talk about AI, and what should folks expect in the next webinar?
Why don't you go, Zach?
Yeah, so the things that I'm most excited about in AI aren't how it replaces people, it's how it better enables the people that you currently have to take away a lot of those mind-numbing tasks, those tasks that they already don't want to be doing, and that it helps alleviate them from that to focus on where they as people can add true value to your organization with critical thought.
Love that, Lorenzo.
Yeah, there's a lot to be excited about. I think when we were kind of planning what we wanted to do with this session and what we want to do with the upcoming sessions, there's a lot of buzz around AI, how it can be applied. I'm excited to talk about a lot of those things. AI is like the anti-strategy button. It's like everyone thinks it's like the easy button. I'll just do it with AI. Boom, done. It's like the opposite of a strategy to say you're going to do it with AI. So I'm excited to kind of talk. That's why we kind of started the conversation with this. Like, you need a strategy, and we can kind of transition to, what are some opportunities. We'll talk about what's generative design, and how is that different from artificial intelligence and machine learning. Lots of really exciting things going on in that space. So that'll be exciting.